So yeah, to reiterate, because I'm almost certain that I kind of messed up when I didn't press play. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the founders of the NAACP, and this was written in 1934. So context is important, but I do think that this is something that will be very educational for people to listen to, and it will kind of give a framework for what I hope will be in these kind of little speech readings from different leaders during different time periods. A kind of building of the united history of how America has grown and developed through the perceptions of people on the ground. So without further ado, no more critical situation ever faced the Negroes of America than that of today, not in... Oh, hold on, sorry, real quick. Oh, I just read straight through this before, and I didn't actually take a break before I realized I messed up on the audio. So, drink break. That is hardly a break. Wow. No more critical situation ever faced the Negroes of America than that of today. Not in 1830, nor in 1861, nor in 1867. More than ever, the appeal of the Negro for elementary justice falls on deaf ears. 3/4 of us are disenfranchised, yet no writer on democratic reform, no third-party movement says a word about Negroes. The Bull Moose Crusade in 1912 refused to notice them. The Lafayette uprising in 1924 was hardly aware of them. The socialists still keep them in the background. Negro children are systematically denied education. When the National Educational Association asks for federal aid to education, it permits discrimination to be perpetuated by the local present authorities. Once or twice a month, Negroes convicted of no crime are openly and publicly lynched, and even burned. Yet the National Crime Convention is brought to a perfunctory and unwilling notice of this only by mass picketing and all but illegal agitation. When a man with every qualification is refused a position simply because of his great-grandfather being black, there is not a ripple of comment or protest. Long before the Depression, Negroes in the South were losing Negro jobs, those assigned them by common custom, poorly paid and largely undesirable toll, but nonetheless life-supporting. New techniques, new enterprises, new mass production, impersonal ownership and control have all been largely displacing a skilled white and Negro worker in tobacco manufacturing, in iron and steel, in lumbering and mining, and in transportation. Negroes are now restricted more and more to common labor and domestic service of the lowest paid and worst kind. In textile, chemical, and other manufactures, Negroes were from the first nearly excluded, and just as slavery kept the poor white out of profitable agriculture, so freedom prevents the poor Negro from finding a place in manufacturing. The worldwide decline in agriculture has moreover carried the mass of black farmers, despite heroic endeavor among the few, down to the level of landless tenants and peons. The World War and its mild aftermath seemed for a moment to open a new door. 2 million black workers rushed north to work in iron and steel, make automobiles and pack meat, build houses and do the heavy toil in factories. They meet first in the closed trade unions, which excluded them from the best paid jobs and pushed them to the low wage gutter, denied them homes and mobbed them. Then they met the Depression. Since 1929, Negro workers, like white farmers, have lost their jobs, have had mortgages foreclosed on their farms and homes, have used up their small savings. But in the case of the Negro worker, everything has been worse in a larger and smaller degree. The loss has been greater and more permanent. Technological displacement, which began before the Depression, has been accelerated, while unemployment and falling wages struck black men sooner, went to lower levels, and will last longer. The colored people of America are coming to face the fact quite calmly that most white Americans do not like them, and are planning neither for their survival nor for their definite future if it involves free, self-assertive, modern manhood. This does not mean all Americans. A saving few are worried about the Negro problem. A still larger group are not ill-disposed, but they fear prevailing public opinion. The great mass of Americans are, however, merely representatives of average humanity. They muddle along with their own affairs and scarcely can be expected to take seriously the affairs of strangers, or people whom they partially fear and partially despise. For many years, it was the theory of most Negro leaders that this attitude was the insensibility of ignorance and inexperience, that white America did not know of or realize the continuing plight of the Negro. Accordingly, for the last 2 decades, we have striven by book and periodical, by speech and appeal, by the various dramatic means of agitation, to put the essential facts before the American people. Today there could be no doubt that Americans know the facts, and yet they remain for the most part indifferent and unmoved. The particular position of Negroes in America offers an opportunity. Negroes today cast probably 2 million votes in the total of 40 million, and their vote will increase. This gives them, particularly in northern cities, and at a critical time, a chance to hold very considerable balance of power, and the mere threat of this being used intelligently and with determination may often mean much. The consuming power of 2,800,000 Negro families has recently been estimated at 166 million a month, a tremendous power which intelligently directed their manpower and its labor probably equals that of Mexico or Yugoslavia. Their illiteracy is much lower than that of Spain or Italy. Their estimated per capita wealth about equals that of Japan. For a nation with this start in culture and efficiency to sit down and await the salvation of a white god is idiotic. With the use of their political power, their power as consumers, and their brain power, added to that chance of personal appeal which proximity and neighborhood always give human to human beings, Negroes can develop in the United States an economic nation within a nation, able to work through inner cooperation to found its own institutions, to educate its genius, and at the same time, without mob violence or extremes of race hatred, to keep in helpful touch and cooperation with the mass of the nation. This has happened more often than most people realize. In the case of groups not so obviously separated from the mass of peoples as are African or American Negroes, it must happen in our case that there is no hope for the Negro in America. It must happen in our case, or there is no hope for the Negro in America. Any movement towards such a program today is hindered by the absurd Negro philosophy of scatter, suppress, wait, escape. There are even many of our educated young leaders who think that because the Negro problem is not in evidence where there are few or no Negroes, this indicates a way out. They think the problem of race can be settled by ignoring it and suppressing all reference to it. They think that we can have only to wait in silence for the white people to settle a problem for us. And finally and predominantly, they think that the problem with 12 million Negro people, mostly poor, ignorant workers, is going to be settled by having their more educated and wealthy classes gradually and continually escape from their race into the mass of the American people, leaving the rest to sink, suffer, and die. Proponents of this program claim with much reason that the plight of the masses is not the fault of the emerging classes. For slavery and exploitation that reduced Negroes to the present level, or at any rate hindered them from rising, the white world is to blame. Since the age-long process of raising a group is through the escape of its upper classes into the welcome fellowship of risen peoples, the Negro intelligentsia would submerge itself if it bent its back to the task of lifting the mass of people. There is logic to this answer, but feudal logic. If the leading Negro classes cannot assume and bear the uplift of their own proletariat, they are doomed for all time. It is not a case of ethics, it is a plain case of necessity. The method by which this may be done is first for the American Negro to achieve a new economic solidarity. It may be said that the matter of the nation within a nation has already been partially accomplished in the organization of the Negro Church, the Negro School, and the Negro retail business, and despite all of the justly due criticism, the result has been astonishing. The great majority of American Negroes are divided not only for religious but for a large number of social purposes into self-supporting economic units, self-governed, self-directed. The greatest difficulty is that these organizations have no logical and reasonable standards and do not attract the finest, most vigorous, and best educated Negroes. When all these things are taken into consideration, it must become clear to more and more American Negroes that through voluntary and increased segregation, by careful autonomy and planned economic organization, they may build so strong and efficient a unit that 12 million men can no longer be refused fellowship and equality in the United States. Now, one of the things I think is interesting is that this is written before World War II. This is also written during a time where eugenics was growing, so there was increased movement to explain the origin of people groups and why human societies organized themselves the way they did. So the conversation about Africa was that Africans were some of the first Homo sapiens to develop, but also the least sophisticated or least developed Homo sapiens because of the staticness of their environment and biome, which is extremely racist if you think about it. But hey, it was science back then, so what do you scientists say? Anyways, best science was ignorant. Anyways, I like talking crap about scientists because they think they're so moral each and every generation, but they make the same mistakes. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that before the 60s and 70s really took off and the black exploitation movement took off and a lot of the cultural changes in black America changed from the civil rights movement to what is now today's African American culture, there was a strong unity in African American families and communities. Even though there was crime, it was self-policing, and there was a high intolerance for those who had criminal backgrounds in African American society because you brought down the community. So the idea was that we worked hard, we proved our worth, and we kept to ourselves largely because we knew that that was the best way to secure our wealth intergenerationally, rather than letting it escape through fleeing to better areas. Oftentimes, black Americans were making movements based off of what was best for their family. This is what led to the northern black flight, and later the southern, the white flight to the south. Conservatives moved down south during the Reconstruction movement, largely because they were trying to set up businesses to help support blacks. What happened, though, is blacks fled north to take advantage of new opportunities up north. But that was also leading to competitions between those southerners who fled up north to take advantage of the factories because most farms were destroyed after the war. And the farming economy never really recovered in the south during that time. So a lot of southern farmers were forced to flee north because they didn't want to live down the south where they felt that there were blacks being free to take their jobs and stuff and be forced to take property alongside them. So they had fled up north. Blacks ended up competing with them up north, and that led to a lot of the racism that permeated during this time that he's talking about. Conservatives who went down south ended up permeating down there, but they often had issues with fighting with the local southern authorities, who oftentimes were able to get into positions of power still because of their local connections, and often the suspicion now was cast towards northern businesses that came in from the white locals. Note also the heed to not suffer in hatred, but instead to voluntarily isolate ourselves. This is not about reparations. This is not about having the government pay us back. This is not about white people suffering. This is about, we understand that we've already talked about our oppression. We understand that we've already told white people what they're doing wrong. The only way forward, if they are not changing things, is to realize, okay, you know what we need to do? We all need to go and decide, screw this, we're going to build our own communities, and we're going to rely on ourselves. And if whites want to help us, then we'll let them help us, but we're not going to rely on the aid of whites or the government. We will support ourselves and earn our own place by creating our own material, our own wealth of social value and consumer value in the economy and functioning of this nation, and we will wield our social and political power as we create our own intelligentsia and our own proletariat classes, and we will uplift ourselves within our own communities to our own elite status. So the idea was very much an insular uplifting. I think this is at least based probably off of what he knew from the Bible, and I think that in today's society maybe we should rethink what it means to support African American movements and to support ourselves growing as African Americans. But as always, this is just one of many different perspectives. And so as we read these different speeches and from these different thinkers, not all will be black. I actually want to get into some Latin America speeches as well. I think that there will be, a lot to learn from the past. And when you go through history, you don't really get the chance to read all of these speeches from these people. And so I plan on eventually over the years getting all these speeches down. All these plan on being things that we're going to teach about in the coursework that we're planning on developing. Which leads me to my next part. I have a couple of videos that I have planned to make. Don't know which order we're going to make them, but I believe the next one I will be making is a discussion about what's next. In there, we are going to discuss a similar concept. Building a nation within a nation to solve a national issue that is affecting a mass of people. Before I talked about how I want to leave the concept of race behind in my family and in my traditions, but I also don't want to leave behind that which created me. So I want to acknowledge the struggle of the African American history in my life, because I am African American, but I don't want my children to struggle with that, especially if they're mixed race. But even if they're not mixed race, I don't want them to be defined by an oppressive worldview or narrative. I want them to be defined by what our people have shown to do in the face of oppression, in the face of struggle, and how we have created a better world in spite of the lackings, in spite of the harassment, in spite of the suppression. In the same nature, though, as I try to focus on becoming more of a Christian than I am one of this world, I think there's a similar plight for Christians to build a nation within a nation. We are of the nation, but not in it. We are of this world, but not in the world. Likewise, I think Christians need to look to people like W.E.B to ask ourselves, what is the best way to solve issues? I think our problem is that we're constantly leaking out as separate organs, all separated from the mass of the body, when we need to unify as a body in order to make works happen, to make social movements happen, to make political movements happen. As such, we are going to get into this. And one of the videos I think we're going to come up with in a few weeks is, what would it look like to have a Christian nation? Would it be an oppressive theocracy that would make all people submit to Christ? Or would it actually be something that's wonderful, free, that allows all people to choose whichever faith they want, but all of them are accountable to each other, because the idea of being immoral or to take advantage of others would be considered wrong in its fundamental value. You don't need to kill people for that or hold them in prisons for that. You can chastise them. Social pressure works pretty well if you are used to the Democrats at this point. If there's anything to teach us, it's that religion, you can take away the God, but you can't get rid of the religious guilt that people can use to control society. So again, religion may be the opiate of the masses, but one of the things I found is that progressivism is the methamphetamine of the masses. So you can take that and smoke on a crack pipe, spanners. Either way, stay blessed, my fellow shepherds, and I'll get back to you later. Peace.